dear respected Thai, dear friends. It's a lazy day in Deer Park, and the mountain is quiet. So tonight we have, thank you brothers for coming, the aspirant brothers and long terms in Solidity Hamlet are here. And we have beautiful flowers, it's amazing. We've been hosting, I think, more than 90 teens. Brother Peace helped to organize, and all of us were part of the staff, camping down in the campground in Solidity Hamlet and Clarity Hamlet. And so even the monks, we came down with our hammocks and our tents and slept out in the campground. It felt like a big slumber party out in nature. At the beginning of each day, Thapa Byung lit a fire, and we would drink tea around a small contained, very carefully contained fire. And slowly the teens would get out of their tents and wander over, somehow drawn by the fire. And we enjoyed moments of silence together before doing some movements and walking meditation up to this hall. And I noticed that when the young people are here, there's a lot of emotion. I think the teen in me is awakened, and the sense of comparing and looking at each other. Do I want to be friends with that person? Do I not want to be friends with that person? So that energy actually kind of comes into the monastery, and we do our best to look deeply and embrace it with the wisdom of non-discrimination. And I felt that it's so beautiful how somewhere on the third day, suddenly there's this opening, and it's like the teens, they've had their devices, all their phones taken away, and they just are looking at each other with new eyes, like, I'm really here, I'm really alive, there's this body, and these are other living beings, and this is wonderful, and I'm happy. I'm happy being in community. So it's very emotional to see all that. It's like waking up to freedom. And I think many teens are quite curious about monastic life. So we'll see if any show up for the rains retreat. So we've been enjoying 3 lazy days after the retreat, and I've used that to go back to my practice and do some research on the climate crisis, and enjoy walks and riding the bike in nature around the monastery. And it's so helpful to just have space to digest what just happened when we offer a retreat. So I learned to reflect and also take notes so I can learn. And one thing that we learned is that we need to create spaces of sharing, safe spaces where young people can open their heart and feel heard, feel like there are people who can listen deeply. We had a powerful session of deep listening with the teens, and I think all of you were there. Yeah. And it's really still tender in my heart to hear the stories of young boys who sometimes not wanted by their parent, or having to immigrate from Asia, Vietnam, and assimilate into American society, feeling not understood, feeling not knowing how to relate to women. I mean, we were sitting with mostly young men and non-binary as well, people, and is it real questions that have to do with everyday life. And the last day when we gave back their phones right away, after 4 days of no phone. So there's this need to have a refuge, and that's a part of the topic for today, the 33rd tenet. Each generation of Buddhist practitioners has to resist the human tendency and need on the one hand, to make the Buddha into a divinity, a god. And on the other hand, to try to find a principle that stands in for a separate self. That stands in. It means you don't call it a separate self, but you behave towards it as a separate self. It doesn't matter what you call it. It could be God, the ultimate, nirvana. So, to resist. So, it's so much easier to have everything clear, to have concepts that we can put our tools on, we can stand on, and feel this is the foundation of my whole being, my whole belief. So this is the tendency we have as human beings. We want to have some kind of concept that is the foundation. And you take away that foundation, I don't know what to say, right? But as long as I have that foundation, I'm good. So one way is to make the Buddha into a divinity, to like a creator God. So Tai talked about different kinds of bodies of the Buddha. We have the physical body, we call it Rupa Kaya. I think we talked about 8 or 9 different kinds of bodies, but it's not so important, 1 or 2. Generally, in early Buddhism, there was a Rupa Kaya, the physical body, and then you had the Dhammakaya, which meant the teachings of the Buddha, so the body of the Dhamma. But then later, the Dhammakaya became the ground of all being, something like everything, the cushion, the leaf, the rain, the cloud, everything is a manifestation of the Dhamma body. And in a sense that when we look deeply into phenomena, we see the Dhamma, right? We see impermanence, we see interbeing. But if we're not careful, that teaching of Dhammakaya can become kind of like the foundation of our way of looking at the world. And if somebody then takes away our Dhammakaya, we feel we are lost. So the Buddha, if we're not careful, can be made into a kind of divinity. And there are some Mahayana texts like the Lotus Sutra, which seem to make they say the Buddha, what we experience as the physical body of the Buddha is actually just what we call the transformation body, the Nirmana Kaya. So this is just to review a little bit what we already learned. We talk about Rupa Kaya. Rupa just means the form, like the physical form. Nirmana Kaya. So it's physical body. You can call this transformation body. So, in a sense, then, the Dhammakaya of the Buddha has never been born and will never die. And what we experience as the Shakyamuni Buddha is just a manifestation, a transformation body of the everlasting, eternal Buddha that is present in the past, is present in the present, and present in the future for all time. So even in the time of the Buddha, there's that tendency to see the Buddha as someone who is more than a human being, that is somehow transcendent. And that comes from this human need to find a refuge. When we're suffering and we don't know how to embrace our suffering, then we look for some kind of refuge, something that we can hold on to, something, maybe you could say, a greater power. And in my own practice, when I notice that tendency, then I I take refuge in the Dhamma, in the path. Because I know, then I reflect on some teaching of the Buddha, like all things are impermanent. And I see the impermanent nature of my body, the impermanent nature of my feelings. If I'm experiencing painful, difficult emotions, maybe there's some kind of trauma from the past which is coming up. And I can see it, I can be aware of it in the body. And I know this feeling is impermanent. So that's the source of my refuge. But if I then take this phrase, everything is impermanent, and I make it into something that's absolutely true, something that is, the truth with a capital T, then I run into the risk of, again, creating this kind of principle or teacher who is somehow the foundation of all knowledge, of all truth, of all being. So in some versions of Mahayana Buddhism, there's the teaching of Vairochana Buddha, very close to kind of creator God. And so we tiptoe close, we look, we need something to devote ourselves to adore, because we are suffering beings, and in the moment it can feel easier to export our suffering onto something higher than us, some being that is somehow more than this experience, this phenomenological experience of the present moment. But then that thing, whatever it is, the Buddha, Vairochana, it could even be a concept like suchness or emptiness, no longer becomes the doorway to our freedom. It becomes an obstacle. It becomes a concept which we are now holding on to. So if we hold on to the Buddha and when we have a Buddha statue, we can bow to it because we touch the awakened nature inside of us, that feeling of being alive, that joy. We have gratitude in our heart for learning the Dhamma. But if we start to dress up the statue and then get angry at people who don't respect the statue, we started to have this concept like this statue is imbued with some kind of power in and of itself that is somehow transcendent or not even just magical, but it is somehow representing something that is beyond. It is a transformation body of the ultimate Dhammakaya, which we see to be permanent. So this is, again, just another way of grasping. And so in the history of Buddhism, there's been that tendency and that tendency also has arisen in response to the situation in society. So we know in Brahmanism, there's a concept of Brahma, which is like the whole universe, the kind of God, kind of creator God. And later, after the Buddhist tradition was established, you had other gods who were manifestations, in a sense, of that eternal principle, like Krishna or Shiva, Vishnu. In some sense, they are all just manifestations of some eternal principle. In India, they call it Santana Dharma. Santana means eternal, the eternal Dhamma. So, as the Buddhist schools developed and grew in India, this tendency, many of the monks coming into the monastery, they are raised in that tradition, right? So they are raised with that folk understanding as well of gods like Krishna, Shiva, so forth. And so, and maybe they devoted themselves wholeheartedly to that one principle. And so when they come in as monks, there's still that tendency. So there are new words, new ways of expressing it, but underneath it is, in the heart, is the same principle of kind of grasping. And so when somebody says something not so nice about the Buddha, we become angry. We want to yell at that person, want to fight for the Buddha. The Buddha taught ahimsa, but we want to fight for the Buddha's ahimsa. And the Buddha saw this, so there are instances where the Buddha said, what if people slander or malign me? What if they say horrible things? How will you respond? And he trained the monks to not become angry when people say nasty things about the Buddha. One is somebody says nasty things about you, but then people say nasty things about your teacher. And does that trigger you? Does that trigger your anger? Or are you able to come back to yourself and breathe? There are many instances of the Buddha getting challenged by like Brahmanical students. And in the sutras it describes the Buddha becoming more radiant, his skin glowing, even as somebody is spewing forth all kinds of excrement out of their mouth towards the Buddha, really nasty things. I think sometimes in the sutra it's not even, we can't even get the feeling for how unpleasant that person had. Clearly they built themselves up to arrive there before the Buddha and say all these things. They probably rehearsed it in their head to try to get the Buddha's goad, try to see if they can make him angry. And instead he just became more calm. His skin became more clear because he felt compassion for that person. He could see their intention, and he doesn't want to demolish their argument. He has compassion. He knows that they've been kind of trained dogmatically to say those things, and he just wants to open his heart and embrace the suffering of that person. So by doing so, of course, he would set an example for his students. So even if his students hear the Buddha being slandered or sworn at, then they could learn how to remain calm. Because, I remember when I first started practicing, and I was at remember in the mountain in Afghanistan, and of course it's quite not maybe a very nice thing to do, but I remember somebody turning to me, he's like, what do you think as a Buddhist? Like, how do you feel about, and I thought, well, I'm not sure the Buddha minds so much about those statues. Anyhow, I mean, it's a pity that somebody spent a lot of time carving those beautiful statues, and I mean, it's a beautiful work of art, but do Buddhists feel offended or angry because they torpedoed the Buddhas? I don't know, I didn't feel anything. Maybe people local there who might have some feeling for it, I don't know. But I remember that teaching of the Buddha at that time, which is, somebody can say all kinds of horrible things about your teacher, about you. Our practice is just to give rise to compassion. Maybe there's something in there we can learn from. I always try to look when somebody's angry with me about something, how can I learn from it and change my way of behaving so that I can do better next time. But if I just get angry and I respond, it's not very helpful.
So this is just an example of what can happen if we make the Buddha into a divinity. It just becomes like, Buddhism just becomes a religion. It devolves into just another religion. Meaning we have some principle that we hold to be sacred, and the rest is profane. Right? We make sacred and profane. We make eternal and ephemeral. And if anyone says anything or defames or slanders what we consider to be sacred, then we are ready to take up arms. We become angry and we want to fight to destroy them, destroy their concept, destroy their nasty words. And so we need to be very careful about this tendency as human beings to make the Buddha into some kind of divinity. If you study a little bit of the history of the Lotus Sutra, for example, in Japan, you might see some of that happening. The tendency to deify not only the Buddha, but to deify one particular text, the Lotus Sutra, and the suffering that one Buddhist sect or another Buddhist sect caused for the other because one thought that the other didn't respect enough the Lotus Sutra, and so they told the ruler to do nasty things to that sect because they don't respect what they consider to be sacred. So this is why Thai emphasizes so much the teaching on arriving at home, seeing every moment being the Pure Land. Because everything becomes sacred. There's nothing that's profane. Everything in us and around us. And when I was a young monk, I would say, but Thai, there's also suffering. It's not all just wonders. But as I matured in my practice, I said that suffering is also a wonder. I was making sacred and profane. I was saying, the wonderful things, those are great. Let's have lots of those. Let's get rid of all the profane things, the nasty, unpleasant, materialistic things, and let's just live in kind of a rarefied, ethereal, pure land that is all happiness and joy, and the life in the Sangha is so wonderful. But of course, that's all based on wrong perceptions. That's the similar tendency to make the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, like the monastery is divine. But down in Escondido, it's just a materialistic world, people running this way, that way. And so we feel like we are somehow polluted if we go down into Escondido. Today I rode my bike down into the city. We're trying to use cars. I'm trying to use cars less, do things by bike. And if I'm mindful of my breathing, mindful of my body, bringing fine manners in my way of going into the shop, going into town, riding the bike, then every moment in Escondido becomes sacred. And the way I treat people is different. If I treat them as, just a worldly person, the shopkeeper, it's quite different than if I treat them as a holy being, a precious jewel of the cosmos. So, if we have this tendency to make something divine, by doing that we make what is not divine, right? We get into dual grasping, double grasping. So that is how we recognize that tendency, and that is how we know how to practice in every moment, to honor every breath, to honor this body, to honor every person who comes our way. You can listen to the sound of the bell. We've been studying manifestation-only teachings, and in those teachings there is a phrase that everything is manifestation. There's only manifestation from consciousness. All that is, the whole universe, all kinds of being are manifestations from consciousness. We can also take that phrase and make it into a kind of God. So instead of the Buddha, we say it's the mind, it's consciousness. Everything is a manifestation of consciousness. So mind is somehow divine, or the ground of all being. And instead of being a training, a mind training, to help us to see that our perceptions are illusory, and often wrong, right? Because as we've learned in other classes, our perceptions are just slivers of the suchness of reality. So that teaching on everything is a manifestation of consciousness is there to train ourselves, to help us to train ourselves to let go of our perceptions, to see that what we want to grasp at in the world is just illusory. But we can flip that around and say that, okay, if everything is created by the mind, then mind is the one principle, the divine, cosmic consciousness. Again, we've called it something else, but we've done the same thing. We've made something into a separate self, something, concept, condition, idea. So the Dhammakaya became like that. The Dhamma body. This is profane, this is sacred. That is a wrong perception. So we need to resist the tendency to make Buddhism into a theistic religion. Store consciousness. The alaya vijnana, right? So it holds, contains all the seeds of anger, fear, mindfulness, awakening, our thoughts. We can make store consciousness into a kind of God, kind of the foundation of all things. And then we kind of bow to our alaya vijnana as a kind of God. Prajnaparamita. There are statues of Prajnaparamita in India, ancient ones, in a kind of female form. The mother of all Buddhas. The wisdom, the insight that brings us to the other shore, is Thai translated. That concept of Prajnaparamita is made into a figure and revered as a kind of goddess, the mother of all Buddhas. When we were at Nalanda in April on the pilgrimage in India with Shantam Set. Shantam and I were walking from a beautiful museum that is there across the street from Nalanda. So Nalanda is an ancient monastery. At one time it was probably the largest, from maybe 500 AD until 1200 AD. It was likely the largest university on the planet. Tens of thousands of monks were studying there, and great masters like Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and many others taught there. The Chinese monk Cunzang traveled from China overland, north of the Tian Shan Mountains, down into through what is now Afghanistan, right, into Kashmir, and in order to bring the sutras that were missing, he felt missing in China, back. And he studied at Nalanda. So it's a very important center for Buddhist, the development of Buddhist teachings. And so we were there, and there are many beautiful statues. Beautiful statue of Avalokiteshvara, very, very old one. In India, Avalokiteshvara is male. But it came to China, and there was probably some kind of cult of a kind of female figure that merged with the teaching of Avalokiteshvara and then became Kuan Yin, which can be a female figure or sometimes a like non-binary figure. Anyhow, we were just coming out of that museum at Nalanda, and we saw many police officers, and Shantam was very curious, what's going on? So he asked one of the officers, "Who are you guarding?" Because we were about to go into a restaurant at the entrance to the museum, and he said, "Oh, the head of police of." Now I'm forgetting the name of the province. Is it Uttar Pradesh? I think Uttar Pradesh, yeah. Which is large, with Lucknow, right? Isn't Uttar Pradesh? I think, anyway. So, kind of the big province that's east of Delhi. So the head of police was there. So, Shantam was quite surprised. Oh, the head of police, he wants to come to Nalanda. And look at the ruins and see Buddha statues. So we went up and we introduced ourselves, and they said, "Oh, he's very interested. He studies Buddhism." So we went in and introduced ourselves to this head of police, and all of his guards were around him. And he's kind of a administrator, but in his free time he writes archaeology papers. So he's written like hundreds of papers, and his main topic is on dependent origination, and the statues in the physical material manifestations of the teaching on pratitya samupad, which is dependent origination. So he studies the development of the doctrine through artwork, through the representations of dependent origination in statue form. I thought, wow, that's fascinating. So again, it's a tendency we want to transmit the Dhamma, so we create a representation of something. But then that representation becomes an object of veneration in itself. And it's no longer a skillful means to understand the Dhamma, but another thing to grasp onto. Okay, so we make the Buddha, Vairochana, Nirvana, Pratitya Samupad, Prajnaparamita, whatever it is, we make it into a divinity. Something that is something we can venerate when our suffering becomes too much. So the way we resist this tendency is through being mindful of our suffering. So bringing our attention not to the object of our devotion, but rather to our suffering, to the experience within ourselves of pain, trauma, ill-being in our body and mind, understanding its roots. Again, it's just coming back to the basic teaching, whether through walking meditation, mindful breathing, whatever it is, we come back to ourselves and just shine the light of mindfulness on that. Whenever we have the tendency to venerate something, it can help us to cultivate humility, to help us to overcome our arrogance and pride. That's good. But it can also have the tendency to bypass what's really going on inside of ourselves. And all of our love and our attention is focused on the object of our veneration, whether in a concept or outside. It's the same activity that's going on. And because the Buddha is such a skillful teacher, it's very easy to make the Buddha into a divinity. And we miss entirely what the Buddha has been trying to teach. So we nod our head and we say, yes, yes, Buddha, I know you are not divine, you are just a human being, that you realize the Dhamma, and that is why you are so happy and free. But I still want to venerate you as a god. So that is what we do internally. We don't maybe articulate it as such, but we can do that. So a master like Linchi turned it back and said, the Buddha is you sitting in front of me. The Dhamma is there facing me. He famously said, because he wanted his students to see, like, this awakened nature is in each one of us. There is only the sacred. All phenomena is there to teach the Dhamma. And so it is only in our only obstacle is in our way of looking. So that is a transformation of our attitude, our habitual way of acting. We want to, it's the same with, and we train ourselves to be respectful of them, but if we're not careful, we make them into some kind of divinity in a sense, like, oh, I can never, I let Thầy Pháp Yung or Sister Dangnim or Sister Trung Chin or Thầy Pháp Hoi or whoever, the elder brother, or Thai. I let Thai do the heavy lifting for me. I'm just here to play and enjoy my life as a monk. But I'll let the elder brothers and sisters do all the heavy lifting because they are realized monks and nuns, and I'll just hang out and just sometimes I'll go around them and I'll get some joy and happiness, and then I'll go back and do my thing. You see, it's the same tendency. So the respectfulness that we hold towards our elders, towards the Dhamma teacher, is there to help us cultivate humility, to learn how to overcome again our arrogance and our pride, but don't then turn it around and make it into the object of our veneration. Because we are all human beings, we all have the whole lot of the seeds, right? It means our elder brothers and sisters also have jealousy and anger and unpleasant characteristics, and I see in myself those things, but I am committed to transforming them, to recognizing them, to receiving the input of the community. So that part, that's good, but don't take it the next step, because there are many communities that I experienced when I went out to learn as a young seeker of the Dhamma, and I observed that there are maybe one or two teachers, they're so wonderful, but all these other students, oh my goodness, they're all just caught up in the hierarchy or the institution. And that would be a real pity. In Plum Village, we try to set up in a way that we don't have like special titles or we get caught in our idea of status, because that is a trap. We become complacent and we lose our practice. So I'm reminded all the time by my suffering to come back to my breathing. That's my mindfulness. I mean, that's the mindfulness bell for me. Is no, it's still suffering. I get in a situation in the community, and I see I still have some attachment to how I want this to come out. And so, how can I embrace that with awareness, with mindfulness? How can I transform that attachment and get more joy? So it's all in this tendency to venerate, make something somehow transcendent. So we do it with the Buddha, and we do it with just about anything. Throughout the history of human beings, just about everything has been worshipped as being somehow sacred. Fire, earth, water, air. If you go to some of the early Greek philosophers, each one of them took one of the traditional elements and thought that that was the basis of everything, and derived an entire philosophy based on that. And that is true as well throughout different societies. You might have a totem and say that totem is somehow transcendent. So again, all of these things, we can see the goodness there that is awakening a higher, a deeper aspiration in our heart to go deeper. But at the same time, we have to practice not to get caught in the form. And spiritual traditions which emphasize, for example, not representing the God or Allah or Jehovah or whatever, and outside of Abrahamic traditions, Vishnu, Shiva, with images that is a little bit in that spirit. They're trying to say, don't get caught in the form of this. But we might not get caught in the form, but we get caught in the concept or in the language. And that is also a kind of form. So if we really want to be faithful to the Buddha's teaching, we need to learn how to let go as well of our attachment to the Buddha and our attachment to our idea of ourself. So I'll share a little bit about the second one, which is the principle that stands in for a separate self. Maybe we can listen to the sound of the bell. So we've learned that there is a cycle of birth and death, but there is no self which moves through that cycle. And we've learned that there's thoughts without a thinker. But these are difficult to understand. It's easy to say, oh, okay, there's a wheel of birth and death, so I'm born into this life, and I grow, and I experience life, and according to my actions, then when I die, I am reborn in another body, and that is the fruit of my actions in a previous life. That is a traditional understanding that preceded the Buddha. It's not the Buddha's invention. Many people ask the question, they say, oh, you're a Buddhist. They say, oh, so you believe in reincarnation. But actually, the Buddha, that was a teaching that was current already in the time of the Buddha. So the Buddha went deeper and he said, looking into that cycle of birth and death, we cannot see any separate self. That our idea of this, who we are, that is somehow permanent, is just an idea. And so that concept of migrating from birth to death is also just a concept. It's not something that we observe in reality. There is birth and death. We see things arising, things passing away in our body, in our feelings, and so forth. But why do we need to create a self in that situation? When we look at a cloud, the cloud becomes the rain. So first there is a cloud, there is no manifestation of rain. Then the rain manifests, and as the rain manifests, the cloud disappears. The water vapor in the cloud, or the droplets, fine droplets of water, come together into drops, and they fall down, and they become a river. And so we say, well, that is the death of the cloud, and the death of the rain is the water running in the river. So in each of these, in this sense, there's the death of the cloud becomes the birth of the rain, and the death of the rain becomes the birth of the river. And it's not difficult for us to say there's no self-nature in any of that. But somehow when we look at ourselves and we look at this complex of habits and tendencies to run away or to go towards things, to have fear, to have attraction, we create an idea, this is me, this is what I like and this is what I don't like. And we believe that to be permanent, as something that just goes through life, from birth, growing, and then death, and then going into the next life. So the Buddha said, we need to look deeper with the concentration of no self. That allows us to see the causes and conditions that are happening in real time, all the time. And just like the cloud becoming the rain and the rain becoming the river, right? We look into our emotions, into our body, and see that it's always changing. And there's nothing permanent we can hold on to. So we continue to train ourselves in that because we know that the tendency is to create a separate self. So our resistance, when we talk about Plum Village or Deer Park as a community of resistance, what is our resistance? It's resistance to grasping at concepts and ideas, some kind of dogma as fixed ideology, whether it's the Buddha as a divinity, whether it's the idea of a self that persists. And that's for the purpose of helping us to calm our minds, not have fear in the midst of change. It makes us very solid, stable, resilient, able to change to let go of our ideas as things change in our bodies and feelings and perceptions, so that whatever comes our way, we are happy. That is freedom. We let go of the obstacle of our ideas in order just to be with the moment, in every moment, to dwell happily in the present moment. Drishta Dhamma Sukha Vihara, dwelling happily in the present moment. We learn that to dwell happily in the present moment, we don't need a separate self. And that in fact, so long as we put our faith in a separate self, to that extent we suffer. I've explained it many times. Vihara is to dwell. And to dwell in sukha, happiness, the opposite of dukkha. To dwell in happiness, in the drishta dhamma. So the phenomena, here dhamma means phenomena that is seen, drishta. So that is visible. It means the present moment. What we experience in the present moment, what kind of phenomena we experience in the present moment, whatever those phenomena, we dwell happily. In the Mahayana, they say the bodhisattva rides the waves of birth and death in freedom. So we don't have fear about death. We don't have fear about birth. We practice to just see that everything is part of the natural flow of things. And when we look with those eyes, then when our body starts to get old, we lose a tooth, we get some disease, some illness, our body gets more sore. We see that's part of life. It's all part of the nature of this body. So why should we be shocked? Of course, in the moment, we like our body to be healthy. But if we continue to dwell on that illness or that missing tooth or that whatever it is, we suffer. So, just like in the story of the second arrow, we learn there's pain, but we don't need to add to it with our suffering around that pain. Just see the pain as it is. That's enough. So the tendency to create a divinity, to create a separate self, that is like the second arrow. It's the kind of low-level rationalizing of our behavior, the kind of story that we tell ourselves. And it's not necessary, not for our happiness. So living in the monastery, practicing with the Sangha, we learn to just let go. The deepest training in Sangha life is training ourselves to let go of our idea. So we do it not only in our personal practice, but also in our meetings. When we have a decision to make, the concern of the elder brothers, and if they are practicing well, the elder sisters, is not whether we do this or that, it's whether you are attached to your idea of doing this or that. So they, a good elder brother will help you to let go of your attachment, because they can see that it's not important whether we do this or that. Most of the time, we can do this, we can do that. It's okay. The problem is when you're attached, and this is something I run up against many, many times in my life as a monk, that I feel so deeply that this is the thing, this is the best thing. So I make a separate self of that idea. I say, we have to do it like this. It's so dangerous if we don't do it like this. There's danger. That's another way of turning it around. Like, one is you want to do it, but then because you want to do it, you paint the situation as being very dangerous for the Sangha if we don't do that. You use language like that. Or it dishonors Thai. Oh, you dishonor our teacher. Oh my goodness, if we do that, we would disrespect Thai. And then, everyone, for sure, is not going to do that thing, right? They're going to do what you want them to do. So Sister Shanluk, with our elder sister, was very skillful in sharing about that. We have to be very careful when we use that kind of language. Like, we want to protect Thai's legacy. But through our protection, we actually create suffering for our brothers and sisters around us. When Thai's legacy is brotherhood and sisterhood. That's Thai's deepest wish. And yet, in our drive to hold on to our image of Thai's legacy, we actually create suffering. So that's very dangerous. See? I'm joking. We need to be very careful when we set a concept against something else in any moment. And it's like a constant dialectic within ourselves. It's not like you just come to one answer and then say, okay, that's it, now I understand. But it's continual learning and adaptation. I call it the wisdom of adaptation. So, in Buddhist history, there are various times when, due to perhaps pressure from the mainstream society, the Santana Dhamma, developing Brahmanism, this root sometimes we call Hinduism, that's more a name that came from the West, because the Indus River was the first river that the Westerners, like the Greeks and so forth, encountered. So then they gave that name, Hindu. But usually in India they call it Santana Dhamma, means the teaching on the everlasting Dhamma. So all of that mainstream tendency to venerate a divinity or the Atman also exerted pressure on Buddhist communities. And that manifested in the form of, for example, one school that became known as the Pudgalavada. So basing themselves on the teaching of the Buddha, for example, the Buddha said, there is a person whose appearance on earth brings great benefit and happiness to humankind. Who is that person? It is the Buddha. So person, Pudgala, means person. Or another example is, in the sutra, the Buddha said, Ananda, do you not see how beautiful is Vaishali? So the Buddha referred to Ananda as a person. Do you not see how beautiful is Vaishali? This is something very normal, very human to say. But by getting caught in the words, then we say, the Buddha said there is a person. For example, the Buddha is a person. Ananda is a person. So there must be a person. So what is just a conventional language becomes something more, and we imbue it with some kind of deeper meaning. And so another sect, related sect, Vatsiputriyas, they expressed it that as there's a self, but that self is not in the five skandhas, but it's also not outside of the five skandhas. So they want to have it both ways. They want to have the self, but also the five skandhas, and there's no self. So it doesn't really make coherent sense. So instead of calling it Atma, you call it Pudgala, you change the words, but ultimately there's this sense of a separate self sneaking its way back in to the tradition. And that is, by studying Buddhist history, we can recognize that tendency in ourselves. And we practice to resist, to create any kind of permanent concept. And seeing that that is going to be, that is based on some kind of grasping. And so as practitioners, we recognize anytime we're trying to make something as sacred, permanent, everlasting, that's a mindfulness bell for us to turn our attention back to what is going on in our body in the present moment and see the grasping that wants to make that thing into a God, a separate self, a permanent, separate thing. You see? So this is the training. This is how I practice. Whenever I have that tendency, and for me it happens mainly when I'm suffering, and I don't, for whatever reason, I rather than turning my mindfulness to my suffering, in that moment I think, oh, it's too much, and then I just want to put all the burden of my suffering on that higher thing, Thai, on the Buddha, on like, okay, well, maybe this lifetime I screwed it up, so at least the next lifetime I'll hang around and be reborn, and I'll do better next time. And then you just hang out and you do whatever, you watch videos on YouTube, you waste your life because you feel, oh, well, I'm the perfect self that I want to make for my life, I cannot realize. So it's like the aphorism, the perfection is the enemy of good. Yeah. When we want this perfect Buddha, a purified Dhamma body, or a separate self, it is like that, like Plato's ideals, right? Some kind of rarefied, pure thing that is beyond the material world. And we get caught in it. And we think this body is not important. And we don't take care of ourselves. And we don't take care of our practice. So it's a kind of wake-up call. And this tenet to help us to come back and nourish our practice. Nourish our every moment mindfulness of suffering, mindfulness of happiness. And just to finish, Thai, as his commentary on this tenet, also talks about a kind of yearning, the longing, expectation that we experience in our heart. That yearning, that longing is not necessarily for anything. Do you ever notice that? When you have this longing, this feeling for longing, but what am I longing for? You actually have to ask yourself, and then your mind runs through a whole list of things you could possibly be longing for or expecting. And yeah, Thai says that expectation, that yearning, could be the biggest obstacle to our happiness. So when you feel in yourself this kind of looking for something else, right? Because underneath all of this, make the Buddha into a divinity, the principle of this, make a stand-in for a separate self, is this feeling, just a feeling, this kind of yearning for something else, something new. So whether you're scrolling down your social media feed, looking for, or skimming through the news, always it's something at the bottom of the screen that could just come up that's going to somehow answer that yearning, that expectation in your heart. So the the invitation is to come back and just look at that yearning and see what's going on there. What is this longing in my heart? And when I practice with that, I find joy. Not when I'm caught on the object of my expectation, but when I turn back in, with the longing as my object of meditation. I see that I already am enough. That was the theme of our teen camp. You are enough. So, thank you for listening and for your practice.